Добро вечер, јас сум Билјана Георгиевска во програмата Клан Дебата. Вечерва одново посветена на неуспехот на Европската Унија да го отвори патот за Северна Македонија и за Албанија кон пристапни преговори. Односно на пошироката слика за тоа што значи за регионот да биде оставен на ничија земја, во момент кога на прагот на Европа се води војна, а падот на довербата во Европската Унија овде ја доведува во прашање можеби довербата во западните вредности. Вечерва разговараме со неколкумина познавачи на состојбите во регионот, со специјалниот пратеник на британската влада за Западен Балкан, сер Стюарт Пич, со регионалниот директор во аналитичкиот центар во Лондон, Economist Intelligence Unit, Джон Хуи, со американскиот професор Едвард Джозеф, како и со новинарката која од Брисел известува за телевизија Клан Ериса Зикај. Останете со Клан Дебата. Сите очи, барем од Северна Македонија и од Албанија, денеска беа вперени кон Брисел во момент на се или ништо околу пристапните преговори на двете земји, блокирани веќе 2 години од бугарското вето кон Скопје. Тензијата овој пат беше уште поголема со оглед на содржината на предлогот за компромис од француското председателство, кое по се изгледа преслика голем дел од бугарските услови поставени од Софија во билатералниот спор кон Скопје, откако Бугарија и денеска обстои на својата одлука ветото да остане, предлогот од Франција го одби и премиерот на Северна Македонија Димитар Ковачевски. Од европска гледна точка, ова е уште позбунувачки, вели новинарката Ериса Зикај, дописник на телевизија Клан од Брисел, која непосредно пред почетокот на емисијава ја прашав какви беа европските реакции меѓу европските представници по овој најнов неуспех на Европската Унија.
Yes, we can call it a failure because the European Union has been not able to unite and show that it can start negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. I mean, today it was reflected even in the cancellation of the press conference. They avoid to organize a press conference where they were, supposed to answer to question of journalists because it's a failure. They didn't want to say in the public that it was a failure. It is, in fact, it is, because the French presidency, although has presented a very good proposal for both North Macedonia and Bulgaria, which is considered for the moment being the best one, and that the two parties might compromise on it with some changes, it did not succeed to convince Bulgaria nor not North Macedonia to have a final agreement. We have seen yesterday it was a kind of hope that we could do it today, and today we could have the good news for both countries, but this was impossible because of a political situation in Bulgaria. And today we have also heard the Prime Minister of North Macedonia. He has very specific conditions, and he considered that the French proposal as it stands now is not acceptable. He was very clear in the press conference, but I can tell you that from the European side, they feel sorry, they feel frustrated because they know that the people of North Macedonia are frustrated because they were finally waiting for this, signal from Brussels in order to, agree on negotiating framework and then to open the door and pave the way to the fixing the date for the first IGC. So it couldn't happen. And they say the same, thing for Albania. They are sorry. They feel bad. It's a kind of, bitter taste today in Brussels among European leaders. You have to know that it was a very important summit for them to show that the European Union is a successful story for enlargement. And it didn't do it because, it's so strange today to hear that
now, what is the prospect of this process, of the EU enlargement? I'm not sure whether the diplomats you have contacted in Brussels, they are aware that the French offer or the French plan was practically unacceptable for Macedonians in North Macedonia in the way it was presented, but not officially. I'm not sure whether it was the official plan and the offer.
Yes, Biljana, you know that today we have heard it very clearly from the Prime Minister of North Macedonia. This is what I told you. We thought that there was a problem only from Bulgarian side, but that's not true, because the Prime Minister of North Macedonia today has explained exactly the opposite thing. He told us in the press conference that, in fact, the French proposals as it stands now, is unacceptable to North Macedonia. So we have a problem, on both sides, on Bulgaria and North Macedonia. And French presidency is really sorry, feels really, sorry that it couldn't make it. But there is still hope. There is still hope, because they told me that, they are going to try until the end of the French presidency, meaning the last day, in order to succeed and have the negotiating framework with North Macedonia and Albania approved by Bulgarian political forces and also approved by North Macedonia. So there is hope. There is hope, and maybe we can do it. You know why? Because today it feels really ugly that you have on one side Ukraine and Moldova granted the candidate status. It will be confirmed afterwards. Until now it seems that nobody has a position to that, and you have this, and on the other side, the European Union has been unable, to start negotiations accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. And some of my colleagues here from EU member states, they told me, that we were thinking about framing our titles like, do we have to go to war to be attacked in order to start accession negotiations with the European Union? And this is very strong, because, it translates the whole feeling.
A lot of people are asking themselves the same thing here, and it's very pity. Erisa, I know it's a busy day for you. Thank you very much for your time. We'll see what's going on the next couple of days until the end of this month.
Thank you, Biljana.
All the best. Слушнавте што вери Ериса Зикај, дописничката на телевизија Клан од Брисел. Всушност таа ја пренесе возбудата и вознемиреноста во Брисел од тоа што, како што таа рече, сега не е само една земја проблем, туку сега се две земји кои се противат на францускиот предлог, што предизвикало вознемиреност меѓу представниците на француското председателство со кои нашата дописничка контактирала. Инаку, пред неколку дена на Преспа форумот во Охрид, земјава беше домаќин на регионални лидери, председатели на држави, премиери, министри, десетици дипломати од Балканот, од Европа и од Соединетите држави. Таму имав прилика да поразговарам со специјалниот пратеник на британската влада за Западен Балкан, сер Стюарт Пич, човек кој скоро 47, скоро 50 години има кариера во армијата на Британија и на НАТО. Меѓу другото бил шеф на воениот комитет на Алијансата, командант на воздушните сили на Косово, шеф на военото разузнавање. Од декември минатата година тој е специјален пратеник на британскиот премиер за Западен Балкан. Најпрво го прашав сер Стюарт колкав е безбедносниот ризик од тоа што земјите во регионов се уште се вон Европската Унија, се уште се блокираат една со друга. Нема видлив напредок во преговорите меѓу Белград и Приштина, има сериозна загриженост за Босна и Херцеговина, сето во момент кога на прагот на Европа се води војна, а регионот е подложен на руско влијание. Колку сето ова ја доведува во прашање безбедноста и стабилноста на Западен Балкан. Слушнајте го разговор.
The war in Ukraine has changed the continent of Europe. Many of us did not expect, me included, to see such an illegal, unprovoked war in our lifetime. And of course it's a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, and it's very fitting and special that your president last night honoured them with an award here at this event. But it changes more than just the tragedy for the Ukrainian people. It demonstrates that illegal grabbing of territory, theft of territory, brutality using industrial scale warfare, which is more reminiscent of a world war, is back on our continent. And this, I think, disturbs everything. People will be worried, people will be anxious, people will be concerned, and they're right to be. The first thing to say is we should all be grateful that the wisdom of your leadership took the Republic of North Macedonia into NATO, and that gives you that support of being stronger together and something bigger. NATO membership, therefore, I remind everyone, is really important. And so everyone talks about EU enlargement, but actually the security issue of a military alliance under political control, which has been successfully defending 1 billion people for 73 years, is something we need to bear in mind. In terms of EU enlargement, the United Kingdom continues to support the Euro-Atlantic journey for the whole people of this region. And we continue to be a strong friend of the Republic of North Macedonia. We continue to work with North Macedonian people, civil society, and of course offer hope to the young people. The young people I meet here are so talented and so aware of their potential that we need to give them that hope. We also see, though, with my background and experience, I see now that security is not a narrow subject, it's a wider subject. Energy security has been weaponized by Russia. So we need to work together. The UK is willing to work with you to modernize, to support energy investment and make it more resilient for the future. We also need to work with you on infrastructure and foreign direct investment. And the UK, again, is a strong supporter of your country and your people in investment terms, and which is my summary point to your question. It is follow the money. It's the money from the West, it's the money from your friends in the United States, the UK, that tends to give you the investment which gives you that better future.
But I'm sure that some amount of money is coming from Russia as well, in this region, not just in this country, but in neighboring countries. How fragile are the countries to Russian influence?
Thank you for pressing me on this. I mean, Russian influence is not new. The region for centuries has been affected by that. And I say centuries on purpose, because it's not just not new, but the style of the Russian influence is not new either. The technology of mis and disinformation may be different, may be technology that we're seeing on this interview, but actually propaganda and the disruption of truth and facts is not new at all. And so the influence can be bought, sadly. The influence can also be corruption. The influence can also be people who've been persuaded to take a different view of the world, and therefore it comes together in the state of Russia as an opposition to that westward journey, that Euro-Atlantic journey that the people have enjoyed. And this influence takes many forms. The United Kingdom is very happy to work with you to counter this. We do it with in many places with many different organizations. And it does take a lot of time and patience. But we must push back. We mustn't allow Russian influence to distort the facts and get in the way of a better future for your people.
You mentioned that there are a lot of talented young people here, but they would like to move. They would like to move at least around EU, in Europe. They are stuck now without EU membership. They cannot work abroad. There are some illegal ways. They are absolutely disappointed of the behavior of neighboring Bulgaria. The news coming today say that official Sofia wouldn't lift the veto towards North Macedonia, whatever is the French plan that we're talking about, but we don't know a lot of details.
Well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. This is a very timely question, and it's very topical, and events are changing, moving quite quickly. So I would be wrong to comment on events that are unfolding. But we need to stay, I have a phrase from my military experience, to stay steady now. And I understand that this spills over into uncertainty for young people in particular, and many families. And I understand that, and we're sympathetic to that. The UK continues to work quietly in support. But it's a very much a bilateral issue. We'll have to see. But my position, our position in the British government is very clear. We support your people through thick and thin, through many decades. We support that Euro-Atlantic journey, and we support it with actions, investment and friendship and civil society links. We don't support it just with statements. But we'll have to see what happens in the next few weeks.
Can you see what stays behind? Is it only a bilateral question? Is it only a burden from the history?
It's complicated, and I'm always nervous wading into conversations on history in this region. And it was British Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, who said the region creates more history than it can consume. So I'm very wary of this for understandable reasons. But it's not 1890, I'm not picking dates carefully enough perhaps. It's not 1990s. It's 2022. There's an illegal war in our continent in 2022. So it's now time to work together with our neighbours, with our friends, with your allies, and resolve as many differences as we can to give that better future.
What about the relations between Belgrade and Kosovo? Can you see any step further in normalization of the relationship? Or
this is an important question, and it's an important question for this dialogue. And the UK government's position and my own position is very clear. We support the dialogue. It is a dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, and it is a dialogue facilitated, supported by the European Union, and we support that. And we look forward to prospects of progress as soon as we can.
We regard you as a friend of this region and a person who knows a lot about the Balkans. Can you see an improvement in general in the last couple of decades?
Of course I can, and every time I come here I see an improvement. The infrastructure is improving, perhaps not as quickly as I would have hoped, and I think infrastructure improvement is a big question for you and your neighbours. And here we are in this beautiful place. We need to protect and preserve our environment. Therefore, for energy modernisation, it has to be a cleaner future as well as keeping the power running. And then, of course, it's about providing that investment which gives the innovation. I can see prospects for your talented young people to move quickly into the new industries which we all need for that better future.
What about this general question? We started this conversation from the war in Ukraine. How long it could take? What are the prospect not just for the people there, but for whole Europe?
Well, we see all the negatives. We see the millions of refugees. We also see that the other side is, of course, the compassion that the North Macedonian people and many other people in the region have shown towards those refugees. But then we see the built environment of Ukraine being deliberately destroyed by Russia. We see the casualty rates against women and children, as well as, of course, tragically, the soldiers who are being killed and injured. So we see that as a terrible tragedy for the whole of Europe. And of course, the effect spills over. It makes people nervous and concerned. The effect of millions of refugees creates distortions, as well as, of course, the compassion that is being shown to them. It also continues to worry me that the food security is now becoming a bigger and bigger problem, which reminds me, as one of my early experiences was doing a degree in geography, that actually strategic geography doesn't change, that actually the rivers, the ports, the ability to move goods to where they need to be, the grain that we need to get out of Ukraine, the way in which we should use the rivers, we should develop our railways in our airports and our ports. These may seem like difficult, long-range, long-term questions for the people listening to this. But if we don't start, we won't make the improvements necessary to keep the people in the region where they belong and need a better life.
Does it mean that democracy is losing in terms of new changing in the world after the war?
The alternative of autocracies and a return to the old centuries is not a better future.
How divided Europe will be next year or 2 years?
Well, we have to all work together. Governments, civil society, academics, thinkers, everybody, industrialists, we all need to work together to counter these negative trends and not wallow in the negative trends and allow democracy to be undermined and allow civil society to be affected. And of course, I worked as the military head of NATO throughout the pandemic, and we mustn't forget that people in Europe, across the globe, but particularly in Europe perhaps, since we're in Europe, have had a tough few years, and so they deserve good governance for the future.
Just shortly, a message towards Sofia. What would be your message towards Sofia?
Well, we continue to work where we are friends with Bulgaria as a NATO ally, and we continue to support the European journey for the whole of the continent, the Euro-Atlantic journey. And so we continue to seek a strong friendship and also expect Bulgaria to fulfill its obligations.
Several British representatives in the last months, they were worried about the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Are you?
I am worried about the situation. Thank you for asking me. I'm worried about the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We must make sure that political disputes, political arguments don't become security problems. And that is my message on Bosnia and Herzegovina. I personally support the international forces presence. We must sustain that. Both the European Union force, Althea it's called, and the NATO presence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's, in many ways, it's a pity that it's still needed, but it is still needed. We continue to support the Office of the High Representative and the person in it, Christian Schmidt. Again, maybe it seems odd that it's still needed, but it is still needed. So we must not allow political disputes and issues to become security problems, and that's my message.
Do you see the whole region in 10 years, let's say, a member of EU, or the alternative plans which are on table will be more actual, like Austrian plan, French plan?
There are many plans being talked about at this event. We are simply committed to the Euro-Atlantic journey, a better future involving democratic values, the rule of law, good governance and human rights.
So Stuart, thank you very much for this interview. Го слушнавме разговорот снимен во Охрид со сер Стюарт Пич, специјалниот пратеник на британската влада за Западен Балкан, кој ги даде своите оценки не само за односите Европска Унија, Северна Македонија, односите со Бугарија, туку и пошироко за состојбите во Косово и во Босна. Но вестите од Бугарија вечерва велат дека Комисијата за надворешна политика на Народното собрание во Софија го усвои предлогот за средување на односите меѓу Софија и Скопје со поддршка на гласовите од опозицијската ГЕРБ. А утре одлуката ќе биде ставена на дневен ред на пленарна седница во парламентот. Францускиот предлог не е најдобриот што сме го добиле, но подобар е во споредба со португалскиот и со германскиот. Не знам што ќе предложи чешкото председателство. Вака агенциите во Бугарија ја цитираат министерката за надворешни работи Теодора Генчовска, која е во оставка, како на некој начин да е било сосема јасно дека проблемот нема да се реши сега со францускиот предлог, па можеби ќе има и чешки. И додека во Бугарија и натаму трае политичкиот заплет, да го слушнеме разговорот со Джоан Хуи, регионален директор за Европа во Economist Intelligence Unit во Лондон. Таа вели дека ова е пресвртен момент за Европа, дека целта на Русија која води војна во Украина е нова поделба на континентот, поради што Европската Унија, сите нејзини членки треба да бидат храбри и да донесат решителна одлука за интеграција на државите од Западен Балкан. Слушнете ја Джон Хоуи.
Yeah, of course. I think that is one of the main questions posed by the war and this geopolitical turning point, which is what this represents. It's really put the question of EU integration back on the political agenda. And that's because, of course, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia have made their application for EU candidate member status. But of course, that also brings the question of the Western Balkans more into the centre of the discussion as well. Now, that what we've seen is that the process has been blocked for a very long time, and that's partly because of local difficulties, bilateral disputes in the region, affecting several countries in the region. But primarily, I would say actually that the process has been blocked, or is in this kind of stasis for a long time because of inertia from the EU side, and obviously quite a lot of skepticism about further enlargement to the region. But I do think that the war does then pose this strategic question for the EU, and it's been posed for a very long time, because a commitment was made to this region in 2003 at Thessaloniki that this region would have the perspective of joining the EU. So they've been waiting a very long time. So the question has been there on the agenda for a long time. What this war has done is really crystallized this as a strategic choice for the EU, and it becomes a strategic choice now because this war is leading to a new division of Europe. That is what the war really means if Russia is successful in essentially annexing an even larger part of Ukraine and establishing this kind of frontier. So for the EU, the question is the EU prepared to see this region, the Western Balkans region, left in some kind of no man's land between the EU and Russia?
That's how the majority of the people feel, practically left behind or left in an empty space with possibilities of strong Russian influence. A lot of people have already developed negative emotions towards EU, and some of them say that they are supporting the policy of Russia, current policy of Russia, or they are even thinking of some kind of other unions with Euro-Asia unions. This makes the region even more fragile. Are there concerns in Europe about the fragility of the region and of the not only North Macedonia but Bosnia as well? Negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina are practically blocked. Is Russian influence dangerous for this region?
I think there certainly is concern in Europe, in Brussels, and in many European capitals about what happens to this region, about, as you say, the fragilities, and some countries are particularly fragile. This region is still quite poor in many respects, some poorer than others. Even though there's been a recovery and fairly respectable growth in recent years, pandemic aside, convergence is very, very slow. Catch-up growth is not what it should be, and that really exacerbates political problems, divisions, social inequalities. So there's lots of reasons, and that's apart from the outstanding bilateral disputes over status and borders and so on. So there's really a lot of vulnerabilities there in the region. So I think there is concern, and there obviously is support for integration in certain capitals, including, as it happens, from the UK, which has left the EU but thinks that this is important for this particular region, that these are small countries, that they need to be brought in to the European Union. So there is support. On the other hand, there is clearly unease, and there is clearly political opposition in key member states, and in France in particular, in the Netherlands, in some of the Nordic countries, in Denmark, for example. And this unease or opposition stems from several reasons. One, there is a concern, which is, I guess, the one that is expressed by President Macron most of the time, which is that bringing more countries into the EU is going to just reinforce existing difficulties of, reforming the union. It's going to dilute the coherence and leadership of the key, the leading member states. Obviously, there's concern about what it would mean politically in terms of maybe more immigration from the region, more competition over jobs and so on. So there's all sorts of concerns, but I think that those skeptics need to be probably more honest and more transparent about their position and whether they do or they do not support the region. Because in the end, the question that they have to ask themselves, EU leaders, EU countries, and especially the skeptics, is whether the risks of leaving out the Western Balkans outweigh the risks or the difficulties of bringing them in. And I would say
they had enough time until now.
Of course, but now I think what's happening is that the war is really crystallizing this choice, and it's a choice that has to be made. You can no longer dither or obfuscate, or delay in this situation where we are. We've got a war on the doorstep of Europe. We've got a potential new division of Europe. So I think it really means that choice now has to be made. You can't delay any longer. Europe needs to say where it stands on this, and to make that choice, and be brave. Actually, politicians need to be brave about making the geopolitical case, the political argument for bringing in the Western Balkans. This is a small region.
Only 18 million people altogether.
It's not going to cost very much. Actually, the EU can very well afford to bring in this region. It's not, we're not talking about very large countries. This is not Turkey. I understand there may be concerns about Ukraine, which is a much larger country with a much greater weight, but this region is small. The EU can afford to do it. The question is whether politicians are prepared to confront the political difficulties and have those arguments out and make the case for bringing in these countries.
Then in such circumstances, with a war on our doorstep, how can you explain the behavior of Bulgarian authorities? Blocking the way of North Macedonia and with Albania as well, because they go together. Claiming the parts of history, claiming that the Macedonian language is not Macedonian language, still talking about so-called language. This is 21st century. Bulgaria was 15 years in the EU. It should have been more European so far. Do you have any kind of explanation?
Well, it's very difficult to give an explanation, but this is something obviously that we've seen in the past. We've seen another veto that delayed the whole process, accession process for North Macedonia for a very long time, and that was resolved with quite a lot of bravery from...
And sacrifices?
Yes, and sacrifices too. Very big sacrifices on the side of North Macedonia, which sacrificed its name, which is no small thing.
Still, some people cannot understand here.
Of course, and I understand that too, because that's your history, and ultimately, the reason why I think these questions assume maybe larger dimensions here than other places is that Well, history is important, a sense of belonging is important, language is important, identity is important. Your sense of belonging to a nation state is important. That is the foundation of your identity, of democracy, you know, these things.
And human rights.
And actually this is, after all, this is what Ukraine is fighting for now, you know, its national sovereignty. An idea that has been much denigrated in recent years in many parts of Europe. But we now see how important it is, because it is the foundation of democracy, autonomy, self-determination, and so on. Now, I think questions of identity and history and language and so on assume a greater importance in this region, because partly because it has been left out of the EU and this kind of larger project, which many people saw as a kind of solution to some of these problems in the region. And also because this is a fairly poor region, and if people don't really believe that they have a realistic prospect of joining the EU, of transforming their lives and building a better future for themselves, for their children, then it's inevitable, I think, that people cling on more to what really does mean something to them, which is their identity and their language and so on. And obviously, I think the other problem is that in many countries in this region, we have fairly fragile coalitions, fragile governments operating without a very large majority. And in that situation, when many parties are contending for power, there is a tendency to politicize these kind of questions and these issues, and then it becomes a political football, and the consequences are obviously then very difficult, and it becomes very difficult to resolve.
Did you have an opportunity to have more details about the Austrian suggestions for step-by-step integration of Western Balkan countries, or French suggestion for, I don't know what exactly it contains, but not for fully integration and membership of the Western Balkan countries in EU, but step-by-step?
So yes, this idea that was put forward particularly by the French President Emmanuel Macron for a European political community that could, so something obviously short of membership. I suppose it's this idea again of concentric circles.
Is it kind of extension of the EU or a parallel organization? How do you understand that?
Well, we have to see the concrete details, but it obviously raises some alarm because it's then seen as an alternative to EU membership. Now, Macron has been at pains to say that this is not an alternative to membership, but his perspective and the perspective of others, such as the Netherlands, is that accession will take a long time. And we've already seen and heard that it's unlikely to happen before 2030. And Macron referred to many decades in relation to Ukraine. Maybe he didn't mean many decades for the Western Balkans, but he talked about many decades. Now the point is, as I see it, that is not a realistic time frame for membership. And what it means is that EU membership cannot then provide an anchor for anything in this region, any kind of political anchor for reform and so on. And then people give up on the idea, and that's already what's happening. As you say, most people, many people, maybe a majority of people now in the region and in this country do not believe that they will join the EU. So if we're talking about decades, then it becomes, that's not a realistic project. So the EU either needs to accelerate this process and take the steps to accelerate it, or be honest and say that actually this is not a perspective for the next decade, but what we can offer is something else. But really there need to be tangible benefits to something like that. For example,
to develop quickly the region, or to prepare quickly the region
for funding. What does it mean in terms of funding? And the amount of funding that is going to this region at the moment is very small compared with the funds that go to the Eastern EU member states or to the Southern Europeans, and they are not going to be transformative in terms of transforming infrastructure, in terms of raising the level of human capital, in terms of green transition, all these other targets. So funding, I think the EU needs to get serious about financing this region. There's been some suggestions that this region should be brought into the EU budget process, for example, and again, it wouldn't cost. It wouldn't cost that much actually for any existing member state. The cost of doing that would be very small, but the benefits could be very big.
Yes, of course, people are more interested to countries to be developed than to have the right to vote in Brussels. I'm sure that this plan could work if there is no way to become normally member of the EU. When EU is dragging its legs in this region, usually Americans come to finish the job quickly. Is it possible? Is it possible now to happen in terms of the war in Ukraine, of the security needed in this region, of closing the gaps for the Russian influence here?
Well, I think you're right to say that the Americans have played a very important role historically in this region. Certainly in the wars that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia, that was the case. Certainly in security terms, the US and NATO, they are the arbiters of what happens in this region, not the EU, which doesn't have a security and defense capacity. It does that through NATO. Now, the US has made its position very clear. It wants to see accession. It wants to see the Western Balkans join the EU. I think NATO will remain the only game in town in terms of security. And obviously countries in the Western Balkans have joined, including North Macedonia, including Albania. And that's important, obviously, from a security perspective. What the war, I think, will do is will have an effect in terms of reviving NATO under US leadership. And the question is whether the Europeans will go along with that or strive to develop their own capacity in terms of a European defense capability. The war has already changed quite a lot. We've seen this security about turn in Germany, which is now going to commit 50 billion euros to building up its own armed forces, which is going to spend more than 2% of GDP on NATO and reaching its NATO commitment, and has committed to arm Ukraine. Something that it's never done before. So we already see that the war is bringing about a change. I just think it's going to be a very, very long time before the EU can have any kind of credible defense capacity. So it's NATO and the US remain the only game in town.
How different is the world now after 24th of February?
I think the world has been completely transformed. This is not just another regional war. This is has become something much bigger than that. This is a confrontation between Russia and the West. Obviously, the US and NATO are not directly involved in this conflict, but they're standing foursquare behind Ukraine. But as I say, many things have already changed, and there will be the war will catalyze more changes. First of all, it represents the breakdown of the post-Cold War order. It's this assertion of power by Russia is a repudiation of that order. What it's doing in Ukraine is creating a new division of Europe, which is inherently then going to be very unstable and dangerous. And if Sweden and Finland join, we're going to see this new kind of frontier, if you like, which will be militarized. And so the world becomes a much more unstable and dangerous place. I think it's going to accelerate the bifurcation of the global order between East and West. We have seen that China is not prepared to forsake Russia, and I don't expect that it will do at all. So this invasion by Russia will accelerate this process of decoupling between the West on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand. And we have also seen that about 2/3 of the world, of countries in the world, are not taking sides in this war, or they are remaining neutral or actually leaning towards Russia. And that's very, very many countries in Africa, it's some in the Middle East, in Latin America and so on. So that's a very big challenge, I think, for the democratic world to, a very big challenge for democracy. To bring those countries, some of those countries on side in this battle over something very fundamental values, which are worth fighting for.
So democracy is not winning in the world?
Not at the moment, no.
For what Europeans should be prepared as a consequence of the war? I mean, in economic terms.
Well, in economic terms, obviously the war is having a very big impact already. And the main channels of impact are via the sanctions on Russia, direct sanctions plus indirectly is having a big impact. Obviously supply chains, which were already disrupted because of the pandemic, are now the problems being compounded by closure of airspace and land routes and destruction of infrastructure and so on. But the biggest impact obviously is coming through the commodities channel and rising commodities prices, not just oil and gas, but also agricultural food commodities, metals and so on. And that is driving this very rapid increase in inflation, which we expect to reach 8.5% globally this year, very high in the US, very high in Europe. And that's going to then have a negative impact on growth because it's going to hit household consumption, especially in a region like this where households spend much more on food and energy, and it will also hit business and business investment as well. So even though we've seen very strong growth in the first quarter of this year in this region, in every country in this region, because that's the post-pandemic recovery that was taking place, it's going to slow as the year goes on. And even though we'll have positive growth, quarter by quarter, growth will slow, and as we go into 2023 and this war continues, which we expect it to continue for actually a long time, and prices remain elevated, then the impact on growth will be quite negative and severe, especially next year. And just to conclude on this point about the economic fallout, the other consequence of this runaway inflation is that central banks, the Fed, the ECB, plus central banks in this region are being forced to raise interest rates to try and counteract the increase in inflation. And then that has, again, a knock-on effect on the economy and raises difficult questions. It will obviously dampen growth. It raises questions for highly indebted countries about servicing their debt, and so also for individuals and households too. So this is a problem. In terms of the war and how long it might last, we expect the war to be, at The Economist and the Economist Intelligence Unit, we expect the war to be protracted, and there's several reasons for that. One is because of the issues at stake. They are quite existential. As I said, for Ukraine is fighting for national sovereignty, for its land and self-determination and so on. So it's very difficult to make concessions and compromises on those. On the other side, the war is not existential for Russia, but it's existential for the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, who need to be seen to win something from this war. So that makes the prospect of negotiations, some kind of compromise, very difficult. And the other thing is that Ukraine has demonstrated the will to fight, the morale to fight, and it's also being aided in that respect with financial and other support, obviously in terms of weapon supply from the West. That means that Ukraine will have the capacity to keep fighting. Now, at some point, both sides will become exhausted, and there may be a pause in the war. There might not be a negotiated solution. There could be a pause, and then things can start up again. Even if there were to be a negotiated solution at some point, I think it's for Ukraine to determine when that happens and the terms on which it's prepared to negotiate. Nobody else has the right to determine that. But even if that were to happen, it's very difficult to see some neat and tidy solution because of the nature of what's at stake, the nature of the issues at stake. And so the danger is that what we will see is a very long conflict, which is not really susceptible to a resolution, and this could just turn into a frontier war, a war without end, more than a frozen conflict. So as long as the war is raging, in terms of there being a hot war, energy prices and commodities prices in general are going to remain elevated.
Is this a war for territory, or this is a kind of lesson, Putin's lesson towards West?
Well, obviously, Vladimir Putin and Russia have not really set out with any clarity what their objective is. We can surmise what their objectives are, and we can also surmise what their rationale for the war is. I mean, the first point, no matter what grievances Russia might have, this war is indefensible, it's an abomination. There's no justification for it. It seemed to be that Russia's objective for many, many years, and certainly in the period running up to the start of the war, was to achieve some kind of new security arrangement in Europe, and they wanted to negotiate that with America, with the US, and nobody else, and those were the negotiations that have taken place. They seem to have concluded that there's no prospect of that happening, and have resorted to this invasion. And it would seem that at least the minimal objective is to prevent Ukraine's further integration into NATO or the EU, to create some kind of buffer between Russia and the West, which will include part of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, plus Belarus and Kazakhstan. It also seems to be a demonstration by Russia that it wants to be taken seriously as a major power. And beyond that, who knows what the motivations are. But I think the one thing we can say with certainty is that this war is not going to end up the way that Vladimir Putin or anybody else in the Kremlin imagined it would. And that is the nature of war, that all wars contain or produce fatal surprises, especially for those who prosecute them and launch them. And usually in the long term, they have negative consequences.
So Europe should brace itself up.
So it also is a big question for Europe about what it stands for, what it's prepared to fight for, to what degree it's prepared to support Ukraine, and what steps it will now take to make sure that this division of Europe is not cemented and doesn't become something of the dimensions of the Cold War.
Thank you very much, Ms. Will.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Следите Клан Дебата, што туку го слушнавме разговорот со Джоан Хоуи, таа е регионален директор за Европа во Economist Intelligence Unit, аналитичко тело на магазинот Economist кој е доста влијателен во светот од Велика Британија. До крајот на денешната емисија Клан Дебата ни остана само уште кусиот разговор со професорот Едвард Џозеф од Универзитетот Џон Хопкинс во Соединетите Американски држави. Тој е добар познавач на приликите во Македонија и на Балканот. Пред 20 години и самиот нудеше предлози за решавање тогаш на спорот за името со соседна Грција. Сега е разочаран што слично се однесува Бугарија. Вели, ова е подарок, однесувањето на Бугарија е подарок за Владимир Путин, кој не требаше воопшто да се случи. Разговорот со Едвард Џозеф го водев при крајот на преспа форумот во Охрид, кога се уште немаше гласање за доверба на владата на Кирил Петков во Бугарија, значи пред неколку дена. Слушнете го кусиот разговор со професорот Едвард Џозеф.
The situation is serious, and people spoke and addressed seriously. There's also, at some of the discussion, you could see differences of opinion among EU members, for example, on this question of whether there should be a EU enlargement path, that already this is what North Macedonia and Albania want, or there should be some kind of new thing called a political community. And even you could see some clear differences there, and it's good.
What was the opinion of the majority?
Well, for me, from what I heard, you heard very clear support from the German special envoy for the Balkans, from the Austrian special envoy for the Balkans, and from some others who said there has to be real EU enlargement perspective, that there's no substitute for EU enlargement perspective.
But according to the news coming from Sofia, they are not encouraging. It's a turmoil, political turmoil there. We are not sure whether the government will survive and whether the parliament will have time or opportunity to have a look of the French plan or to vote on it.
Well, my opinion is, first, it never should have come to this. So this is a Bulgarian violation of their obligations as an EU member. It's complete exploitation. It's additionally unfair because North Macedonia and Greece, not just North Macedonia, but North Macedonia and Greece together as partners, entered into a true compromise called the Prespa Agreement. And so this country has done and taken the steps that, as did Greece, so it was not just, I want to emphasize that, Greece also made huge concessions. And in fact, those concessions are part of the reason why Bulgaria is doing this, because Greece acknowledged Macedonian nationality and Macedonian language, and they didn't like that. So it's exploitative, and on top of this, what's new is this situation has potential to help Vladimir Putin and Russia in this region.
We don't know what is going to happen in a week time during the EU summit, but if the veto stays, will North Macedonia and the region become even more fragile and even more open for influences from Kremlin?
The answer is inevitably yes, and it has to be yes. The answer, and I don't think anybody can argue that it's not yes. Why? Because that's exactly the objective of Vladimir Putin. And people are always asking me, will there be new war and things like this? And my answer is there doesn't have to be a new war for Vladimir Putin to win. So he doesn't need, there can be, and we should be concerned, and we shouldn't ever rule out in Bosnia, for example, that there could be some violence and things, and those things can escalate. But really, Vladimir Putin can win without any war at all. This type of uncertainty is a victory for Vladimir Putin. It shows he can demonstrate this. Look, EU and US, they don't deliver on what they promise. This is a foolish thing. They can't even stabilize this region. And so he doesn't, and plus, one other thing, he has allies in this region. So he has in Bulgaria, he has President Radev. In Serbia, he has President Vučić. So he has two big allies in this region.
The EU was dragging its legs with decades, and obviously it's still dragging its legs. One of the sentences of your recent interview was, now again, US has to finish the job in the Balkans. What you mean by this sentence, and what could be the next step by Washington?
Well, Europe has to finish the job in the end. It cannot be done by Americans in the end, because this is European continent and U.S. is U.S. So, but resolving some of these key critical points where EU is blocked require assistance from the United States. So we need to be very present on some of these issues.
Are there any steps? Any steps, visible pressure towards Sofia, towards President Radev, towards those forces who are against, obviously, EU enlargement?
Well, we have to explore and identify those steps. That's what we need to do. And the U.S. Needs to be looking at that urgently with this EU Council meeting that is coming up. We have to really look closely and see what possibilities there are.
The weather says that this is the end of the interview. Thank you very much for your time.
That was a dramatic
end of this conversation.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
But we have to, I have to say this. Just keep rolling. You keep rolling?
Yes.
This is very appropriate because I remember the fantastic Macedonian movie Before the Rain.
Oh, yes.
So,
yes, this is an interview before the rain.
Yes, but you know that rain was a metaphor in that, hoće li biti kiša? So,
for the changes, let's say.
Yeah, but some negative changes. So we have to hope that we get that sunčano.
Sun rays will come faster than the rain. Okay.
That's right.
All the best, Mr.
It was a pleasure.
Joseph.
Thank you so much.
На овој начин го завршивме интервјуто, разговорот во Охрид со професорот Едвард Джозеф. Тој во својот кус разговор за телевизија Клан вели дека до овој спор со Бугарија, Северна Македонија и Бугарија не требаше ни да дојде, дека тоа што ја разлути Бугарија е всушност преспанскиот договор со кој Грција призна македонски јазик, македонска нација, и тоа е нешто што не ја одговара на Бугарија, дека Владимир Путин, председателот на Русија, има овде во регионот сојузници, еден од сојузниците му е бугарскиот председател Радев и така натаму. Јас ви благодарам за вниманието. Ке ги следиме случувањата околу ветото кое се уште обстојува за пристапните преговори на Северна Македонија и Албанија со Европската Унија. Самитот на Европската Унија трае и утре во бугарскиот парламент ке се расправа за предлогот на француското председателство кое денеска попладнево помина во Комисијата за надворешни работи во Народното собрание во Софија. Ке ги следиме случувањата. Ви благодарам за времето и пријатна вечер ви посакувам.